Okay, we're ready.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is Steve Cady, and we are here with our author Sandbox with Gervase and Bob, and we are going to have a great discussion around Dialogic Organization Development, its approach to transformational change, and they've got a new book that's coming out to hopefully be a ground breaker and maybe a ground setter or page setter, getting us all on the same page. And so thank you guys for being here today. I really appreciate that. And we've got John here with us as well. John's going to help us organize some of the polls and some other things that we're going to do. So here's the two handsome guys. We are really glad that you all are here. Thanks for coming today. This is where you guys say hi. Thanks. Yeah, we're glad to be here.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Yeah. Oh, for us. Oh, yeah. I thought you were still talking to the audience.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah. Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah.
And go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think this is the first time Bob and I are actually co-presenting this material. I was just thinking about that. I've done about a dozen, but by myself. But I'm excited to do this with you, Bob. Even though you're in Florida and I'm in Vancouver at the moment.
Gervase, is that why you seem to be looking at him and laughing?
So in that picture, yeah, that's an interesting choice of picture. I didn't choose that picture. I don't know who chose it, but I like it. It's a good picture. Yeah.
Great. And yeah, so John, do you want to take over in terms of we want to do any opening polls, and then let's get the show started with them as well.
Yeah, actually, Gervase and Bob have the opening poll, so I'm actually going to make Gervase the presenter for the intro, and he's going to get that set up right now, and then we will just kind of dive right in, and so they have some great opening poll questions to get us started.
Yeah.
Great.
So
and,
hi, everybody.
And we have I'm sorry,
Okay.
I was going to say one thing real quick. We have a really great group of people in the chat room. We have about 26 people. So welcome, everybody. I'd love for you all to share what's the question you bring today, or what's the question that drew you to this webinar today. I'd love to hear that. And go ahead. I'll turn it back over to you, Gervase.
Thanks. Welcome to everybody who's shown up. It's a little weird to do this looking at my computer screen, not being able to see you. We've got quite a bit of material. We're going to kind of be drinking from a fire hose with you today for the next hour. A lot of this material, you can find out more about it at the website dialogicod.net that has all our articles and videos and that kind of stuff for free downloads. So I'll just take off. When Bob and I started working on this idea, and I think it's important to understand that what we're doing here is we're trying to understand a bunch of things that have already happened in the last 25 years in organization development. And Bob and I both started writing about this about the same time 10 years ago, and he was calling it the new OD. And he was having a hard time getting his stuff published because editors will go, well, if this is new OD, then other OD must be old OD, and new is better than old, and you can't really prove that. We don't like your paper, and we're not going to publish it. And so I was calling it postmodern OD, and I would send it off to the editors, and they would go, well, there's not enough Michel Foucault in here. We don't like it, so we're not publishing it. And then Bob came up with this brilliant distinction between dialogic and diagnostic OD, and all of a sudden that rang a bell, and we got published, and we started winning awards. And I think that story in and of itself kind of makes the point we're trying to make here, that there's something very important about language, and that we all know that in some way, and that it really powers how things happen. But there's always a downside to things like this, and one of the things about the label Dialogic OD is, I think for a lot of people who don't actually read our work but start talking about it, they think it's about having better dialogues, and that's not really what this is about. It's about the underlying processes that result in transformational change. So we want to start by getting a sense of who's on the call right now, who's listening to this, and we have a poll. I'm going to turn it over to John to run the poll for us.
Yep, give me just 1 second because I got to take back ownership so you guys can see who is responding. So give me just a second while we launch those polls. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and launch the first poll. So how do you mainly identify yourself? And if it's an other, so if you don't identify with any of these, put it in the chat room, put your response in the chat room. We'll give you about 30% of you voted, so the votes are coming in, you guys, and then we'll close it and share the results. Give about 10 more seconds. Go ahead and get your votes in there. All right. Good. So most people have voted. About 85% of you voted. And so these are the results. Bob and Gervase, can you both see those results?
Yep.
Yes, thank you.
Yep. So we have internal OD 11%, external 43%, change-oriented professional 29%, and academic 12%. Manager and executive is 5%. And you want to go right into the second one?
Sure.
And so how much do you believe you currently know about Dialogic OD? And so we'll go ahead and launch that. Do you believe you know nothing at all, very little, some, or a great deal? Everyone's voting. They're voting much faster this time around. So we'll go ahead 10 more seconds to get your final votes in. All right. And so there's the results, gentlemen.
Good.
Okay, great.
Okay, well, I'm going to turn it over to Bob now
By the end of today.
talk about some of the background.
Okay. Why don't we move back to the slide presentation?
And then Gervase, you should have the invite.
Yeah, what I'm seeing on my computer here, I don't see my slides. So I think you need to make me presenter.
I did. So you should see an invite that says.
You might need to close. Yeah, when you close the poll, you might need to make sure that you've said close the view.
Yeah, I'm not seeing that. Let's see. It says people can. Don't know why I'm not getting that.
Well, why don't you see if you can figure it out? I'll just talk for a while without the slides.
Okay.
It's not absolutely critical at the moment. It'll be handy in a moment, but instead of sitting around with dead airspace.
Yeah.
Not quite sure what the
Okay, it finally showed up.
Okay.
Asking me to take over here. There we go.
While you're doing that, one of the questions that a couple people brought, they said what is the definition of transformation we are using? And then Judith Kat says hello. She's glad to be here with you all.
Hi, Judith.
Another person said, how do we shift employer attitudes towards people-driven OD, horizontal, bottom-up versus process-focused OD, top-down? And then somebody said change-oriented professionals and academic, that there's an external consultant, service designer, community development. And so there we go.
All right, I appreciate that input, and I think we'll see how at least our initial comments address some of that or not all of it, and I'll try, at least when I talk, I'll try and keep in mind and the different audiences. I think an important thing here is that we're in a world of framing what's going on, and right now there's a frame called Dialogic OD that is intended to try and convey if you will, a way of thinking about looking at things that most of the people on this webinar are already familiar with, but puts it together in a different way, perhaps. At least that's our notion. And having been around OD since the early 70s, my quick comment on it would be, over the years in the 80s, 90s, the turn of the century or whatever, there are all sorts of things that started happening directly or around the world of OD, social construction, complexity sciences, large group methods, wanting to do inquiry versus diagnosis, partly related to appreciative inquiry, the notion that we're not in unfreeze, movement, refreeze anymore, we're in continuous change. All these kinds of things were going on. And at least in my life, they were always referred to as exceptions to the foundational premises of OD. And I think the turning point for me personally was in the middle 90s when I was at an OD network conference in San Francisco. I had recently published an article comparing the Lewin on-freeze, movement, refreeze model of change with models of continuous change in Chinese philosophy. And at a plenary session, a very, very, very prominent person in OD got up and said, I don't care what's going on out there. There's still no better model of change than Lewin's on-freeze, movement, refreeze, except now we don't refreeze anymore. And that is crazy making to me, because what it does is it suggests that somehow we make an exception for all these things, but we're still going to stay in the models that we've always been on. And so we just treat it as an inconvenient deviation. And I began thinking it was more than that, and it was a signpost trying to figure out that there's actually a different theory of change that's implied by all these things. So let's take a look at the next slide and where that takes us in our thinking. So now we start looking at all the kinds of things: appreciative inquiry, World Cafe, future search, polarity management, art of convening. All of these kinds of things are not necessarily traditional OD in the way we've thought about it, and which we named it as diagnostic OD because that was a central part of it. And most of these don't contain that, which led us into the notion of what do we call it, which was dialogic OD. And let's take a quick look at what do we consider to be part of dialogic OD. Dominantly, dialogic OD combines what we call the interpretive social sciences, that's linguistics, discourse, culture, meaning-making, sense-making, all the social construction, all the kinds of ideas around that reality is something that is created by social interaction, along with the complexity sciences, especially emergence and self-organization. That these are actually quite different ways of thinking about things, and that when you start combining them, they create a different paradigm of change. And so if you're using the kinds of techniques that we've just shown, and you're operating out of a diagnostic on-freeze, movement, refreeze type of orientation, you can use those methods, but you will use them in a way different from the way somebody would use them if they're looking at them through a different lens, through a different mindset, through a different way of doing things. And once you do that, you begin to see a different formula for change, which we call the secret sauce. And Gervase will be saying something about it in a minute. But let's take a quick look at the difference between diagnostic and dialogic. This is a chart that I'm only going to touch on briefly. It is the original chart that we did in an article we published in 2009 when we were first trying to find a way to describe what we were beginning to say were two different ways of thinking about doing OD. And the traditional foundational method was based on organizations are open living systems. There is a reality. We can discover it using diagnostic processes. We collect data. We do problem solving. We envision a future. We reach out to that future with our change management methodologies. We refreeze it, and we've changed behavior and move on. And dialogic OD for us began to be a different way of thinking about things, drawing on newer and more recent kinds of thinking and philosophy in the sciences. Organizations are created by the people in them. They are meaning-making systems. Reality is socially constructed and negotiated through processes with people. If you can create containers and processes to produce new generative ideas, that will lead to change. Change can be encouraged, but it's mainly self-organizing. Change is continuous. And what we're trying to do is really change a mindset about change, where change is not planned and directed, but change is emerging. So here are going to be 8 items that really form a critical aspect of what we're saying, which is a mindset about change. This mindset is applied to things that we already do and think about, but when we apply it, we begin to think about them differently. The first and a very important one is reality and relationships are socially constructed. It means that there's not something independent of where individuals are, but it's the individual negotiations and agreement among people implicitly, directly, consciously, unconsciously, that creates our realities. Organizations therefore become meaning-making systems, and the question is, how is the organization currently constructing itself and making meaning out of what it's experiencing, and is it stuck in old patterns and old traditions and old ways of talking and enacting with each other so that they're stuck, leading to a third point of view, which is language, the way we communicate, not only the words that we're doing now, but gestures, symbols, written, verbal, matters, because language, in fact, creates the way we think about things. It gives us concepts that are imbued and embedded with historical meaning when we talk about things. One of the great difficulties Gervase and I had is that the language in OD is embedded with a historic way of thinking about change, that if we use the same words in the same way, we are simply saying the same thing that has already been said and trying to come up with something. So it means also that if you want change, it sounds trite to people outside of it, but it means changing the conversations. That includes who's talking, what are they talking about, where are they talking about it, how are they talking about it, are we repeating the same thing over and over again? And I'm sure everybody out there has sat in on listening to the same story being told and retold and retold and retold. And as long as it continues that way, in the same rooms with the same people in the same ways, there's not going to be any change. The notion that groups and organizations are inherently self-organizing. They are not on-freeze, movement, refreeze, but they are in processes where if they are disruptive in some way, they will reorganize on their own. Maybe not the way you want it, maybe the way you do, but they will reorganize. The way that happens is you increase differentiation, you increase diversity in the system, and that will disrupt the existing way of doing things, and you need to increase that before you start worrying about getting everybody in agreement and coherence. A lot of people like to cohere more quickly than is perhaps appropriate because of the discomfort of the discordant voices. And transformational change, which for us is a profound change in how things are done, how things are conceptualized, a dominant shift in mindset of doing and seeing and being, and then it's more emergent than planned. It comes out of the situation of people in their conversations redefining the way things are, leading to a final point, which is, since everything emerges out of an interconnected whole that is socially constructed, consultants are part of that process. Whether you are talking or standing on the side of the room, you are part of the process and part of the conversation about people's beliefs about what's going on and what your role is. So consultants are never apart from independent observers facilitating something on objects and on people, but are always somehow part of the process. This is a mindset that creates a different way of looking at change and change methods, which in the next slide we'll try and summarize very quickly, and then Gervase will get to the secret sauce. So if we say that there is a dialogic mindset, and what we were trying to do is say, we're trying to come up with an ideal type. This does not exist in the world today purely, but this is the definition of what it begins to look like. So from a dialogic mindset, we are a believer in social reality that's constructed by the people in it. We see organizations as networks of dialogic interactions and meaning making. That the emphasis is on what kind of discourse and generativity is or is not happening in the organization. Change is emergent, continuous, iterative, and transformational more so than developmental, which would be building on or transitioning from some existing form of being. That discernment is through inquiry, not diagnosis. We're not trying to go in and find out what the factors and forces are. What we're trying to do is create dialogic inquiry in the system, which in itself will create a new reality, as opposed to discovering something about an existing objective reality. The consultant is immersed with the system and is part of interactions, and the change process is not necessarily hierarchical or top-down, but it can start anywhere and spread out as communications and dialogue starts communicating in the whole rest of the organization. Now, I know I just did a tremendous data dump, but we got a couple questions we'd like to see, and not if you're paying attention, but just sort of how to emphasize going forward. So if we can put the third question up, that'd be a good place to start.
Yep, I can do that. And then just so Gervase and Bob know that due to the limitation of the system, only 6 of the entries got put in there. So for all the other ones, we'll have to put them in the chat room. But and for this, everyone out there, this is a you can select more than one option for this poll. And so it's which aspects of the dialogic mindset are currently part of your thinking and or practice. And so you can select as many as you'd like. So let's go ahead. Voting is open. And votes are coming in.
Can I pose a couple of questions, John,
Yes.
while you're doing that?
Yep.
For those out there from the chat room?
Yeah.
So we got a couple questions here in the chat room, and one is, can Dialogic OD apply to developmental change? Do you consider and that's from Scott, and Steve says, do you consider transformational to be necessarily positive or multifaceted in its impacts on various stakeholders? And Scott says, and presumably a diagnostic OD will not do as well as transformational changes, ? And Steve says, let's see here, he said hi to Roberta. And Zach says, Bob, from a practical and application standpoint, how is Dialogic OD introduced into a traditional conservative organization? Diagnostic OD steeped in action research, we can pitch evidence-based and goal-oriented change that the executives can relate with. So that's some of the chatter that's going on in the chat room.
Let me just say a couple things, because I think Gervase is going to address some of that in a few minutes as we move on. But certainly, I think you're dealing with, when organizations are stuck, when they're dealing with things that are beyond their beliefs that they can manage or control, when they need a new conceptualization of what's going on, it's a potential time to be trying to work more dialogically than diagnostically. And again, Gervase will say more about that. But it certainly is a dilemma trying to introduce something like this to organizations that want a lot of control and demand a lot of control, whether that'll actually work for them or not. Did we get a result? Okay. Oh, a lot of, okay, great. Terrific.
Yeah, well, that's consistent with my expectations. I think anybody I know who's doing transformational work is actually doing this stuff. But we just haven't had much of a language to talk about it up until now. I think one of the consequences of that is that a lot of consultants have gotten stuck with a method. And so they'll be an appreciative inquiry consultant or a future search practitioner or an open space person. And companies, when they want to run one of those processes, they'll come and hire you, but typically not get engaged at a more strategic level around the architecture of the whole change process. And one of my hopes about Dialogic OD is it gives us a platform for those of us who do this kind of work to engage at a kind of a more strategic level and be able to see the connections between these various methods. I think we got one more poll, don't we?
Yep.
Yes.
Go ahead and launch that right now. And so the next question is, for everyone, which transformational ingredients have you paid attention to in your change process?
This one I think is a little too soon.
It's almost too soon, isn't it? I'm looking at it going, wait a sec, that's what we're about to talk about. Maybe we should take that poll back and we'll put it up later.
Oh, I don't know if we can do that.
Can you give just a little primer? Can you give a little primer on it, just to make use of it? Can you give just a teeny primer and see if there can be any use out of it?
I think it would be better to just let Gervase explain it.
Okay. Let's close it, and we'll share the initial results, and then I'll see if I can go back in while you guys are talking and bring one back.
Thank you for that. That's helpful.
Well, that's interesting. Okay. Generative images is the one, yeah.
And so, so Gervase, I'm going to go ahead and make you the presenter again, and then I'm going to go back and try to recreate it.
Great. And Steve and John, what you're doing is very helpful. Thank you. And thank the participants for contributing.
And for some reason, it just takes a long time for that share my screen message to show up on my computer.
Have you got it yet?
Yeah. But while we're waiting, let me respond to the thing about, how do we sell this into organizations that are very control-oriented? And it's also related to, where does Dialogic OD seem to be more useful than diagnostic? And one of the points that Bob and I have been making is that it's really not an either-or. Like, both of us were definitely raised on diagnostic OD, and it's still part of my mindset, and it's more of these things are combined together. As I'll be talking about, the come on, slide set. Here we go. We think that where Dialogic OD, and the reason Dialogic OD is emerging is because it's the most effective way to address adaptive challenges, or to address problems where no one knows what the right answer is. I'll be talking a bit about that. But anyway, we think that underlying all these different methods, whether it's open space, future search, World Cafe, whatever, whether or not they actually lead to change depends on one or more of the following three things showing up. And I'll be talking about each of these, about emergence, narrative, and generativity. I did a study a number of years back of 20 sort of successful Dialogic OD change efforts, and what we found in that study was that only 35% were actually transformational. And somebody asked the question, what do you mean by transformational? And we mean an actual change in a state of being, so that whereas an incremental change helps an organization get better at what it's already doing, transformation actually changes what it's doing in some sort of fundamental way. And as you can see from that study, we found that that out of the 28 variables, really this idea of generativity, new ideas, and this idea of emergence showed up as being real markers of what was different between incremental and transformational change. And one of the things I found for appreciative inquiry, which has been the focus of my research, is that you can come at AI from a diagnostic mindset or a dialogic mindset. But it seems to be the people who get the amazing results when they use AI are coming from this dialogic mindset. And we think part of that dialogic mindset is recognition of emergence, and we've been very influenced by Peggy Holman and her work on emergence. And this is sort of her way of looking at it, that for emergence to occur, there has to be a disruption of some sort, and that, which is kind of interesting because, when I was starting out as a consultant, manager would say, we want to hire you, we want to make this change, but we don't want anybody to be upset. And, I sort of went along with that for about the first 10 years of my practice. And it's almost like in the dominant managerial discourse, disruption is a bad thing. You want to avoid it. And the thing is that if you're going to have transformation, disruption is probably going to happen. In fact, you probably need to embrace disruption. And of course, there are a lot of different people now talking about this, the need, in the business press, about leaders who are constantly messing things up for people as a way to spur innovation. And the second thing that I think is important about Peggy's work is she points out that in order for that disruption, that bringing a system to an edge of chaos, for it to be successful, you have to avoid the desire to move towards some sort of coherence too quickly, and to be able to live in that and to actually increase the amount of differentiation in the system, which could mean bringing in diversity of points of view, diversity of voices, diversity of participants, but increasing that so that when the system does eventually find a new coherence, that it reorganizes at a higher level of complexity in some way. And this is sort of Peggy's current model for how that happens, which we think is a kind of a generic kind of image of a dialogic OD process. You create a container for new kinds of conversations to take place. You create opportunities for increasing differentiation around some sense of something that is driving an adaptive challenge of some sort, and then out of that allow a coherence of some sort to emerge on its own. So when you're operating out of this particular point of view, you're believing that rather than seeing organizations as stable entities that kind of exist, and then every now and then you come along and intervene into them in a way that creates change. You're looking at organizations as actually processes that are constantly in a state of change at varying rates of speed, and varying things are changing at varying rates of speed. And so that our job as consultants is not to come in and unfreeze and refreeze them, but our job is to come in to punctuate, deflect, amplify, nudge things that are already in flow, and that things will emerge regardless of anybody's attempt to control stuff. And in fact, trying to control emergent processes usually ends up creating more problems than it solves. So the second underlying sort of set of ideas here is that, you know, talking is action, and that, or the great IA statement, words create worlds, that in organizations there are dominant narratives and discourses that take place that allow us to make meaning of situations, and that the most important of these are these storylines that academics call narratives, right? And these are coherent stories that are shared by a group of people and explain how things are, and that, you know, what narrative ends up coming to dominate has a huge set of impacts. Many of you may remember recently in Canada, we had a guy run into our parliament buildings attempting to shoot people. And, you know, what happened after that was two competing narratives emerged. You know, one was he's a jihadi, he's a terrorist. The other was, you know, he's a nut bar, he's off his meds. And you could see how whichever one of those narratives ends up being the one that becomes accepted is going to result in a whole different set of actions and policy implications and so on and so forth. And so, you know, those of us who pay attention to this recognize that narrative is a very important core piece of what sustains organization reality and changes organization reality. Now, a diagnostic mindset would want to go into an organization and diagnose what the narrative is, and then analyze that, and then figure out what the right narrative ought to be and try to implement it in some way. Those with a dialogic mindset don't think that that's really possible. That, in fact, there is not a right narrative, that at any time in any organization there's a multiplicity of narratives. Some are more dominant, some are more repressed, some are at the margins. What we can do is help people look at the consequences of the narratives they hold, understand the variety of narratives influencing a situation, perhaps recognize which narratives are privileged or suppressed, and certainly to help support the emergence of new narratives. And I think from a Dialogic OD point of view, that's a lot of what the work is around helping the emergence of a new narrative. Where are we on time here? Let me just take a look. 10:36. Let me tell you a story from my own practice. I was asked to come in and do a piece of work with a telecommunications company that wanted to redesign its management training processes around a new model of human resources and 4 skill sets, and the idea that these skill sets require different skills at entry level, supervisory, middle management, and executive. And one of the reasons they asked me to help them with this was that they, even though they were very successful, very large, well-resourced, they never had any executives actually come to any of their training programs, which I don't think is all that unusual actually for internal training groups. But they wanted to start having that happen, and I'd had some success with their executives, and so they thought, can you help us do this? And I said, well, why don't we interview your executives about what they think great leadership's about and how they went about learning leadership. And the training group said, oh, there's no point doing that. Our executives don't know anything about leadership. Which at that moment sort of raised a little red flag for me. And I said, yeah, well, and I said, well, wouldn't it be useful to know how they think about that? And I suggested we do a kind of an appreciative inquiry sort of thing where I match them up with one of each with my graduate students and go in and interview these leaders about you know, their ideas, but their great moments of leadership and that sort of thing. So they agreed to do that. And what happened, of course, is that when they went in and did these and their story was, our leaders aren't great leaders. This is their narrative. Our leaders are all political animals that bend with the wind and do whatever they need to cover their ass and won't stand for what's right. And so that was their story. And so we went in and interviewed these leaders about their moments of great leadership of course, the story was quite different. And one in particular, there was this guy, Dave, who hated this one particular executive because 10 years previously, Dave had been tasked with implementing this corporate-wide training program. And as he started to launch it, this one leader who had just taken over some subsidiary said, no, we're not going to do that in our subsidiary. And Dave felt personally betrayed by that. And ever since then, I hated this guy. Anyway, coincidentally, he ends up being the person paired with my graduate student to go in and interview that executive. And they say, you know, tell us about the greatest act of leadership you can remember. And this guy says, well, about 10 years ago, I'd taken over this new subsidiary, and we were supposed to do this training program. Anyway, he goes into explaining his side of the story and how, you know, he had all this pressure to do this, and resisting this was the right thing to do to create a new message, to create a new culture. Anyway, the story is Dave walks out of that interview, turns to my student and goes, oh my God, he goes, I love this man. You know, I want to follow this guy. And so, of course, what started to happen then was that the water cooler and stuff, as these people in the training function were hearing these stories, their story about their executives began to change. And as a result of their story changing, they implemented a whole lot of other risky things that allowed them to really start to ally with their executives around their training processes. So that's narrative, that's the power narrative. We understand that. We understand that a lot of times, and one of the things in this book that we've been working on, and some of the other stuff we've been working on, is this idea that, you know, a dialogic mindset operates like in one-on-one encounters, in a process consulting point of view, in ways it looks at groups, and in these large group interventions. They're all, you can bring a dialogic or a diagnostic or a combination of both into any of those situations, and they result in making different choices. Now, the one I've been working most on, and the one that the least number of you have been thinking about, is this idea of generativity or generative images. You'll see here a quote from Ken Gergen. You may or may not know that this paper by Ken Gergen in '78 was one of the seminal influences in the development of appreciative inquiry. This idea that instead of research being about testing and predicting, you know, propositional statements, that wouldn't it be better if our social science was geared towards increasing our capacity to challenge the guiding assumptions of our culture and to raise fundamental questions, and that allows us to think differently about different things. And this is what generativity is. And one of the head of the OB department at Case, until his death, Suresh Srivastava, one of his sayings used to be, the most powerful force for change is a new idea. And that's what a generative image is. It's a set of words or phrases or a picture that allows us to think about old things in new ways. And you'll remember from the slide I showed earlier about the research, we found that in transformational change processes, or those that were transformational versus those that weren't, one of the key things that happened was a generative image appeared. And I think the most iconic generative image of our age is sustainable development. You know, before that image showed up, ecologists and business people had nothing to say to each other. And in fact, here in British Columbia in 1987, the head of future planning, vice president of future planning for the largest company in British Columbia, was overheard in the ski line at Whistler saying to somebody, yeah, this ecology thing will just blow over. Like, and then sustainable development showed up. And then all of a sudden across the planet, without a complete shift in that narrative took place, and all of a sudden business people and government turned to ecological organizations and said, you know, what should we do? Tell us what to do. And sustainable development has been so generative that even 25 years later now, it's still tossing off innovations. But notice that no one knows what it is. And that's part of the power of a generative image, is its very ambiguity. The fact that we can't define it, but there's something compelling about it, it intrigues us, and it helps us think about things in a different way than we could have thought about them before. So what happens is when a generative image shows up, it changes what we think, and it changes the decisions. All of a sudden, I see I have options for action I never had before. And when you look at cases of appreciative inquiry that have been highly successful, one of the things, if you start paying attention to this, you'll notice, is that they very often contain a generative image. Sometimes they even start with one. at British Airways, instead of studying recovery, they studied exceptional customer arrival experiences. What makes an image generative really depends on the situation in which it shows up. So in the case of British Airways, the whole idea of an exceptional customer arrival experience was something new. It just altered the frame of how we thought about them. What is that? And how do we do that around here? And what would that look like? And so it changes what we think, which leads to new ways of acting, which of course over time, as we see ourselves and others acting different, that's what evokes changes in our shared attitudes and assumptions, and then builds it into the culture that eventually shapes what we think. And so I think those of us involved in Dialogic OD, we aren't trying to change the social construction of reality, and understanding how a generative image comes in and does that is part of the deal. So back to this question that gets raised about, well, how does this fit in the real world? This is, some of you may be familiar with the Kinnavan model by David Snowden, who was the head of knowledge management group at IBM for a while before he went off on his own. The key idea, I think, here in Snowden's idea is, do we understand what the cause-effect relationships really are? And when we understand what affects what, then we have a simple situation where really it's a categorization problem. We need to sense what the problem is. We go, oh, it's that problem. We stick it in, and here's where we can apply best practices where that makes sense. But if cause effect is not known, the whole idea of applying best practices is actually one of those things where you're trying to control stuff that actually typically ends up creating more problems than it solves. For those of you who work in those kind of command and control organizations that are trying to loosen them up, this 2007 article, this is a Harvard Business Review article, and it's a really good one to give to your managers to help them start just kind of thinking out of the box a little bit about how to do things. And what he says is, when cause effect requires investigation, the application of expertise, then we've got a complicated situation. And you can see this as pretty much being the diagnostic OD world. If you go in, you collect data, analyze it, and then you can respond. But when you're in a situation where cause effect is only perceptible in retrospect, right, that we really don't know what affects what, and the world is too complex. And some people would argue as soon as you get people involved, you're in that world, because how people make meaning of something in one situation or one organization is different from how they make meaning in a different organization. And a lot of times things happen that are surprising, sometimes predictable, sometimes they're not. But it's only really perceptible in retrospect. And what Snowden says, the way to make a decision in these situations is you begin with a probe. And a probe is an experiment. It's you try something. You try something, and then you see what the impact is. Jim Collins' last book was on organizations that thrive in uncertainty. And in that book, he talks about the same thing. He's got a different name for it. He says, fire bullets, then cannonballs. When he looks at organizations that have been able to thrive in uncertain environments versus the ones he matched them up with that weren't as successful, this is one of the differences. They don't make big bets at the front end. First, they try a lot of little stuff. See what works, then get behind that. Then when you figure out what's working, then you put the big bet in. You can see this is a very different approach to change than have a vision and march toward that vision. It says for these sort of large problems, these complex issues, no one really knows what the right answer is. So we need a more emergent approach to change. And the way I think about a lot of these dialogic change processes like future search or open space or appreciative inquiry in a large group context, what they're trying to do is get us all on the same page around what the issue is, and then help get people together who have similar ideas and motivations to self-organize around their own particular solution and launch a bunch of them at once. And then the leader's job is to get in behind and try to figure out what's working and what do we want to resource and what do we want to actually bring into our organization in a bigger way. One of the models we found useful is by Ron Heifetz, he's not an OD guy, and he doesn't talk in the language of OD or complexity, but interestingly enough, all his stuff fits beautifully into this. And if you're not familiar with his work, he talks about the difference between adaptive challenges and technical problems. And I love this line of his: the single biggest failure of leadership is to treat adaptive challenges like technical problems. And I work in a business school, and what we train MBAs to do is to treat everything like a technical problem. Define the problem, get the right data, analyze the data, figure out what the right solution is, then implement it. And when you're dealing with a real technical problem, that's probably the best way to go. But adaptive challenges aren't like that, right? They're problems where a lot of people are going to disagree about what the problem is. Is there really global warming? That sort of thing. And that any change that's really going to result in change is not going to just be a technical fix. It's going to require that there's a change in values and beliefs and relationships, and so that the people with the problem have to be involved in solving it. Because what we're focusing on there is not changing their behavior. We've got to focus on changing what they think and how they make sense of the world. And typically, to solve an adaptive challenge requires stakeholders from multiple places across organizational boundaries being engaged in this as well. So this is another set, and again, there's some Harvard Business Review articles by Heifetz and company on this set of issues that, again, help those of you who are trying to convince managers who like to be in a command and control world that, maybe they need to start thinking about more emergent ways of focusing on change.
Hey, Gervase.
So, yes.
There's a couple things in the chat room. I just wanted to bring them in there just so you could react before we go to the next one. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah, so one is, can you offer a couple more examples of generative images? And then one that goes along with that is, Olga wants to know, can we say that a community of practice is a generative image? And then Bill wants to know, do the two axes of the diagram have labels?
Sorry, what? The last one?
Let's do the first two, and then we'll come back to that one.
Okay. So, sure, I'll give you another example of a generative image. So I was working with in an organization where this organization decided strategically that they wanted to create more empowered work teams, leaderless work teams, self-managing work teams. And the way they decided to do this was when they had a group of people they thought worked well together and they were going to promote their manager, they would just move the manager out and not replace them. This is their way of implementing leaderless work groups. And one of the places they did this was with a group of professionals who all had advanced degrees, and this was a group of people who were troubleshooters. And they would go off into the organization independently, and they brought together both a sort of a technical engineering expertise and a managerial accounting expertise and another sort of market-specific expertise. So they were very highly skilled and quite unusual in the expertise they brought. And they would be called in to sort of troubleshoot things. And there was about 10 of them. And they decided this would be an excellent group to be self-managing, and so they got rid of their leader. And after about 3 months, they wanted a leader again. And the senior manager the group reported into, I was consulting to at the time, said, "Would you please go find out what's going on with this group?" So I went in and talked to them, and what it turned out was they were in this sort of classic authority paradox. And I think generative images, one of the things I've found about generative images is that they're great for helping people get unstuck when they're in an either-or place. And the authority paradox works like this. So what would happen is one of these guys would go and they would go off and do some work in some part of the organization and come up with some solution, some fix, some patch for their particular what's going on in that part of the organization. But then before they felt like they could implement that, they'd have to get back with the team and make sure everybody was okay with that. Now in the past what they do is they call up their boss, and in a minute they'd say, "Is that okay?" "Yeah, okay," and then they do it. But now they felt like they had to get back to the team, so every time anybody wanted to do anything, before they could make a decision or do something, they had to have a team meeting. And they found this incredibly cumbersome, right? And the authority paradox is, I want to be authorized to go do stuff, right, without having to come back and check in with you. But I don't want you going off and doing stuff without coming back in and checking in with me. So they've been stuck in that. They didn't really realize it. So we did a kind of process where we got this stuff up, and I used a kind of an appreciative inquiry thing, and I find that sometimes an image that's generative will vote for the group. And in this case, what happened was they were talking about best teams they'd ever been on. And this one guy talked about a United Way campaign. that he'd been a member of. And in this United Way campaign, he said, you know, we had a bunch of people from different organizations. They all came together, and we had to go out and we had to create deals with other organizations, and we didn't have time to come back and check in with each other. So we decided that the best thing to do was just to say, whatever decision you make, we'll support it. And so another guy in the room said, so you mean trust costs less? And boom, trust costs less. And this group was an incredibly generative image, and it started a whole conversation around, well, what's the price of distrust, and how much does that cost us? And you can see how that connects with these guys had this sort of an accounting kind of mindset, and they love this trust. So that was a very generative image for this group, and it allowed them to think about ways pretty quickly that they could reorganize themselves to manage themselves and solve that problem. So whether or not an image is generative depends to a great extent on the group in which it shows up in. You could take that same image, take it, trust costs less, into a group of HR practitioners or something, and it doesn't do anything for them. It doesn't give them a way to see the world in a different way. So whether or not the term community of practice would be generative or not would really depend on the group in which that showed up. You know.
Very quickly, Jerv, we need to watch the time very carefully because we're running out of time. But one of the things that on generative images, just to name a few quickly, and then we'll go recalibrate where we are, is retrospectively they don't sound so original. The sustainable development is, now we've heard it so much, it's not as generative as it was originally. Things like think globally, act locally, when it was originally came out, was more generative than it might sound like today. Often they will transcend polarities in some kind of a way or not, and will either emerge out of the situation or sometimes put into it. We got about 5 or 6 minutes, Gervase, so I think we need to figure out whether to take more questions or where to go.
Yeah, good point. And I want to amplify that. One of the best places to look for a potential generative image is in an either/or, and to put those two together in a way. And then and sometimes it's confusing. But I think let me just plow through. We got a few more slides here. I want to talk about dialogic conditions for transformational change. So some sort of disruption of prevailing social reality seems to need to take place. Then this idea of creating a container. And I've been doing some work on what is a container, and what's a good container, what's a bad container. In the book, Chris Corrigan's written a nice chapter for helping us think about this. You know, where a different kind of conversation can take place than normally happens in the organization. And then this idea of emphasizing generativity rather than problem solving, that is emphasizing the attempt to search in a future-focused, possibility-oriented sort of way, as attempting to figure out why isn't this not working. I got a paper coming out in Jobs in the next little while on a study we did at Chicago Transit Authority, looking at the impact of problem solving versus generative ways of approaching a problem on people, and the data is pretty clear on that. Generativity just has so many more positive impacts. And so we're looking on fostering conditions that will lead to new ways of thinking and better outcomes, but without a commitment to a specific change. We don't want to put leaders in the position of having to pick winners ahead of time. But and finally, you know, we need to find ways that, because for people to get engaged in a dialogic change process in a way that's generative, they have to care. And if they don't care, then what's the point anyway? So the key conditions for these things to happen: sponsorship. And of course, that's true for most change process. It's extraordinarily true for dialogic change. You need to have someone with the necessary resources and support who can support emergent change. And I noticed for myself, part of my consulting work now, I spend a lot of time at the front end, you know, educating people about the emergent change process and what their role is going to be in that. And you know, really, you need to develop an effective sponsor change agent working relationship. Initially, sponsors are going to want to treat change agent like project managers. That doesn't work in a dialogic change process. They have to be allies. Rather than, you know, the sponsor telling the change agent what to do, the change agent needs to tell the sponsor what to do, that sort of stuff. Then whatever, and part of the front end work is to really frame what this adaptive challenge is, and to frame it in a way that's going to make people excited and compelled and want to get engaged in that conversation. And my frame for that is we need to figure out a way that we describe this challenge in a way people will crawl over glass to be a part of that conversation. And then we also need to identify who's the appropriate community for addressing this issue, and how are we going to get them to get engaged in these conversations with each other. Very often the right stakeholders are outside the organizational boundaries as well as inside. And so that needs to go on. And then convening events that build relationships amongst community members so they're ready to engage in the change issue. And also that, you got the general thing. So I think the primary thing that we're doing is that we're helping an organization step up to that disruptive edge, that chaos edge where emergence will happen. Then we want to enrich the networks that in the organization so that information and energy is flowing as freely as possible so that people who are motivated and have similar ideas can find each other and self-organize around these probes. And then we want to launch them, right? And then once we launch them, we need to make sure that there is a system for tracking things people are trying and a way to provide support, that there are Slack resources available to support good ideas and good stuff going on. And there's a chapter in the book all about that. I think one of the big sort of failures of dialogic change processes at the moment is so much time and attention goes into the event, and not nearly enough time and attention goes into thinking about what's going to happen after the event, and to ensuring that sponsors, that there's enough Slack resources and that kind of stuff for that to happen. So that there are ways to be monitoring and providing information to sponsors about what people are doing and what the impact is, and so that they can sense and respond to that stuff. So the summary here is a lot of different innovations that have appeared in OD. We think when people learn and try to apply these in a kind of paint by numbers way, a lot of times, sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. People don't really know why. We think the dialogic mindset is an explanation for what it takes to be successful with these different processes, and it means paying attention to narrative, emergence, and generativity. And that how an OD practitioner uses these new methods depends more on how they think than any specific technique. We got a book, and we think it's a really good book. We spent a lot of time and love on this book, and I'm working with all the different collaborators. We found people around the world that we think are really great practitioners and thought leaders on this stuff. And we went through many different drafts so that all the different chapters are coherent and they fit together and they make sense. And we're offering a great 30% discount, so rush right out and buy one.
And I'm sure you use the code. It's on the screen, but in case anybody's listening on the telephone, the code is DODN4, the number 4C, DODN4C. And it's only good between June 4th and the 12th, but we negotiated that for those of you listening in on this. So if you don't have the book and you want it, go get it. And for those of you that already have it, thank you.
And we're also running a conference in Vancouver this August. So just if you're interested in coming for the cheap price of $290 Canadian, there's a few spots left, and it's going to be a pretty exciting time. You can get a brochure on the dialogicod.net website. And turn it back to John for a poll.
Cool. Thank you very much, guys. Give me just 1 second. And so, just so you all know, I know that some of you might have to leave. The slides, the Nexus slides and their slides will be available along with the recording. After today's session, it will be sent out within 48 hours. If you do have to leave, that's okay. But please take the survey at the end. So the Nexus webinar feedback, it'll say, go to webinar, it'll say, once you leave, it'll say, send us feedback. Go ahead and click on that and fill out questions to give feedback to not only our panelists, but also to us at NEXUS4change, so we can continually improve your webinar experience. So go ahead and do that as you leave. But we're still going to wrap up with a couple more polls. And then kind of a final discussion and hearing from everyone in the chat room. So Gervase, Bob, do you want to go back to the transformational ingredients question? Or do you want to just go to the going forward, what aspects of Dialogic OD are you most interested in learning about?
I don't remember the question, but why don't we put up the poll while we talk about whatever that question was.
Yeah, so we'll do this.
So
Going forward, what aspects of Dialogic OD are you most interested in learning about? That one is launched. And the other one I was referencing is the one that we recreated, the one that you said was too early.
Yeah. Well, we got that data anyway, so we're good on that.
All right, so we'll just give about 10 more seconds for everyone to vote.
And can you remind me what the question was that you wanted answered?
Oh, the one from the chat room?
Yeah.
That was in your slide where you had the 2x2 model of the best ways for Dialogic OD. The person was asking for the XY axes. Is there names for or labels for those axes?
No. Yes. No, there isn't in the Kinevin model. It's not like it isn't a. It looks that way. It shows up that way, like an XY sort of thing, but it isn't. You could also put it on a continuum, I guess, or it's just the way that Snowden put it together.
And so do you guys see the results of the poll number 5?
Yeah, good. That's useful. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, folks.
Go ahead and what do you think Gervase and Bob should focus on doing next, you guys?
Yeah, that's the next poll.
So go ahead and get your votes in.
What I would add on next, there's some really great comments in the chat room, and it's just full of just a lot of content that could be addressed here. And I'm looking up here. Let's see here. So, like, you go back to generative image, an image or text with words and phrases. So someone's a bit confused about that. To a lot of interest in the generative image. An image, not a concept or idea. The use of image makes me think of a visual or a graphic. Well, why do we call the generative image an image, so to speak? So people are really triggered and interested and curious about image and generative image.
Great.
I think another theme that's coming out is the interpersonal aspect. And Trevor says, it strikes me that trust, emergence aspect is crucial. We're essentially asking our organization's leaders to just trust me with moving into Dialogic OD. Important perhaps that trust or lack of doesn't become the elephant in the room that sidetracks Dialogic OD efforts. And it just keeps going. Let's see here. I understand it. Nicole, as I understand, generative images are intended to make you think visually. And if we have an image of the future, we will know how to work towards it. And another person, how do dialogic processes compare to diagnostic ones in terms of cost? And
in terms of what?
Goes on. Cost, finances, and actually.
Right.
If I can come in just for a moment, Steve, and not to throw everything into disarray, but it seems like people are, or at least a number of people are focusing on the phrase generative image as a visual versus an idea, which can be expressed visually or verbally or textually or symbolically or something else. And I think it's all of those kinds of things. It's something that is evocative of a new way of looking at something. Believe it or not, just to be archaic, back in 1957 or so, the term organization development was a generative image for the field, which conjured up all sorts of different ideas, images, values, beliefs, or whatever that people then tried to describe. So if people are thinking that it means specifically a picture of something, it's much broader than that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of comments here, and I am aware of time, and I just think we need to do another 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 with you all, and just keep having a continued dialogue with you around this. And I think a lot of people would enjoy that.
Right. Anybody who's left on the line, I can see workshops captured about a quarter of you. If you're interested in knowing about workshops on Dialogic OD, shoot me an email, And I'm easy to find. Just Google my name and it'll immediately get you to my email address, and we'll make sure you know when those are available. Around the building networks, also interesting. If you're interested in being part of the network, shoot me an email. And
yep. And on that note, we're also very interested, for everyone out there, in building that network of practitioners and researchers. And so Gervase and Bob, I know we've spoken about it too. So definitely interested in working with you guys to continue to keep that conversation going forward as well.
Super.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and hide these results. Let's stick around for just a second. And so for everybody else out there, give us some feedback. Over here on the top right of the slide, you see a bumper sticker Gestalt checkout. In either the questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel or the Chatsy screen, for those of you who are still left, let's just give one or two words or a phrase that comes to mind as you're leaving today. So how are you leaving today as kind of a checkout? And we'll kind of read those and have a checkout from Gervase and Bob. I've already mentioned the GoToWebinar feedback. Here is the offer and the link for their book. These, like I said, these will be sent out within 48 hours. I will do my best to make sure they get out before tomorrow. And then we'll have an online debrief on LinkedIn. Gervase and Bob, you're more than welcome to come to the NEXUS4change LinkedIn page and be part of that discussion. And then next week we have the fireside chat, another fireside chat, The Power of Appreciative Inquiry and the Benefit of SOAR with Jacqueline Stavros. And then there's the link for Gervase and Bob and the Dialogic OD conference on Thursday, August 6th in Vancouver, and the link to go to that. So, and I also sent that out to everybody in the chat room and in the questions tab. So, Steve, do you want to go ahead and read some of the responses from the chat room, and then we'll have Gervase and Bob kind of close us out?
Sure. I'll just the last few ones are really a lot of people saying thank you. Thanks for the fire hose. They're looking for a fire now. They didn't say that. I said that. Lots of connections made. Many more to come with integration. Grateful for thanking the two scholars have done. Very helpful. Onset says sustainable leadership, management, sponsorship, and intent are the most important elements for success. Let's see here. How has the methodology been implemented in practice? Thank you for a great session. Overview, great session. Thank you all. Great session. Does Dialogic OD lead to implementation projects? Thanks. Great, insightful orientation, Dialogic OD. Where can I find the slides? So there's just a lot of interest, still percolating questions, and a desire to stay connected. So John, I'll turn it back to you, and Gervase and Bob, you might want to say a few closing comments, and then John will talk about next steps.
I'll do a couple. I'll do a couple more, you guys. Robert wants you to do a workshop at the Cape Cod Institute.
Hi, Robert. Thanks.
So King said, great session, great examples, stimulating and thought-provoking from Robert. Hungry for more, as Gervase described it earlier, was a lot of information. Marina, it says you challenged her.
I want to say on the dialogicod.net website, there's a bunch of articles. Those of you interested in the generative image thing, there's a couple, I think, really good articles on the nature of generative images and where they come from and how they work, and examples of that stuff in practice. So help yourself.
Cool. And then Marina said thank you. So with that, do you guys have any closing comments? And then we'll kind of wrap it up.
Well, I'll just be appreciative of people working with us through this technology and on an idea that Gervase and I have been working on and trying to explain for many years. And people hung in and I think get what we're trying to do. And I'm always grateful to have a knowing and welcoming audience. So even though I can't see people, I wish I could. Hello to everybody and thanks for being here.
Yeah. And Steve and John, I'm appreciative for this technology and this network you've developed. I've been on the other side of a number of your webinars, and it's just fantastic. It's a fantastic resource and a channel for all of us. Thanks for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I think that the Change Handbook spurred a lot of this. reading through and learning from all the different folks that have developed, Open Space, World Cafe, Future Search, and Whole Scale and so forth, all of those folks that you mentioned, when you talk to all of them, learn from all of them, I walked away with hope for the future of our planet. I walked away with hope for the future of our communities, and I walked away just really motivated to help those people connect from all over the planet, to know that they're not alone, because there's so many people doing this work, doing dialogic-based work, and they oftentimes feel alone, and you're not alone. And so the mission of Nexus is to connect the great work, the great people, the great projects, and be that nexus for that all that good stuff that's going on around the world.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yep. And then
we should put a link to the video of this on the Dialogic OD website, so people can find it who don't know Nexus.
Yeah, we will definitely.
That's easy to do.
Yep, we'll send you the link.
Okay.
Great. And then just another kind of primer for you guys that are out there. One of the main pieces of feedback was building a network for people doing this type of work for dialogic practitioners. So we will be having several conversations coming up using Maestro Conference, where you guys will actually be engaged in those discussions. So small group discussions and building that network. So if you guys see an email from us and encouraging you to come to those sessions, we would love it if you would be there. So thank you, everybody, for coming to our session today. Thanks, Gervase and Bob, so much for all your work, putting on a great session. I think this was really awesome. So I look forward to talking with you guys in the future. And for everybody out there, thank you very much. This is John Spalding and NEXUS4change, and we look forward to seeing you guys on the next one.
So long.